So in the previous video, I suggested that there's a difference between what matters in survival and what is survival. And I suggested that what matters is that there's enough continuity of psychology and values, and that we can have that without survival. So I want to continue pursuing that idea a little bit, and what I want to do is think more about sort of what we are and how that might help us buy into this idea that what matters is enough continuity of psychology and values, and survival itself is not so important. So we looked at this contrast in the previous video between a heap of sand on the one hand and a steel ball on the other, and we noticed that, well, okay, so what's important here is that the main contrast between these two is the degree of connection among the parts. So the parts of the steel ball, the steel atoms, are all super well connected to each other in the steel ball, and the steel ball has very sharp boundaries. The heap of sand, the parts are not well connected at all, and the boundaries might be harder to draw. And I suggested that while we're not actually like either, we have a tendency when we think about personal identity questions to think of ourselves as if we're like the steel ball and ask, when is there the same steel ball? Like, I'm a steel ball, when is the steel ball and is me still around? That sort of image that we have is a little bit mistaken, and that maybe we should instead think of ourselves as more like processes, like the flowing of a river, or the spinning hurricane, or a flowing river. So I want to pursue that idea a little more and see what that would say about us. So a process, well, it has many parts. So the hurricane has many different parts, many different water molecules, and so on. The river has many different parts. There are many different pieces of many different quantities of water flowing through it. The parts are constantly changing, right? So the hurricane is picking up new water and losing old water. The river is there's water moving through the river. And they interact in complex ways, and that's particularly obvious in the case of a hurricane, that you get this really big, impressive shape that then moves around, and as it moves around, maintains its shape, even though the parts are constantly changing. And they don't have sharp edges in space or time. When exactly did the river come into being? When exactly did it end? The river can sort of wiggle around and move, and same thing with a hurricane. And there's no one thing that's holding the parts together. The river is in a bed, but the river is just flowing, and there's nothing that, like, within the river that holds the river. There's nothing that there's all the water and then something holding all the water together. It's just all the water. And the same thing with the hurricane. They're all the parts of the hurricane, and there's not another thing that holds them all together. So what you have is just a whole bunch of pieces interacting in a complex way that kind of maintains that organization. So you just have connected, organizing, changing parts. And that's what a process would be like. So maybe you're a process. Maybe you are just a psychological process. So this idea that you're a psychological process goes back 2,500 years to the Buddha. And we have all these different representations of him, changing representations. But it's not just an old idea. It was pursued, for example, by David Hume in the 1700s, and one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century and the early 21st century, Derek Parfit. So what is this idea? Well, so you would have many parts, but they'd be psychological parts. So they'd be your memories and your beliefs and all of your current experiences. They'd be interacting in complex ways, right? Your memories and your current experiences interact to produce new memories and new experiences. They're constantly changing. Your memories are constantly changing. Your experiences are constantly changing. There are no sharp edges. What that means, I'll come back to in a little bit. And there's no thing, the idea would be, holding all of those different psychological parts together beyond the psychological parts. They're just like in a hurricane. They're just connected, organized, changing parts. Then the idea is there's no you beyond the stream of experience and the psychological processes. There's just the stream of experiencing that you're having right now and the psychological processes that are going on as the experience is happening. But beyond that, there's no you that's somehow holding all of that together. You just are the composite stream as it changes. So perhaps right now you're having a feeling of love for your significant other if you have one, or love for somebody else. And right now you're having a visual experience of this screen of your computer, and maybe you're hearing a siren in the background. And then, something happened, and you recall something that this person who you love did. You're still looking at the screen, maybe you're still hearing the siren, but you have this memory pops up. And now you feel some anger at this person. But then the siren fades and you hear a voice, maybe it's this person, and the voice brings to mind what you like about them after all, and you feel some forgiveness for them. And maybe at the same time you look away and you glance down at the table because you don't stare at the screen just consistently while you're watching this video. So what we have is a stream of experiences, right? Just as the what's in the river is constantly changing, what's in the hurricane is constantly changing, but still held together, interacting in these complex ways. So at first we have some experiences, then we have some others, then we have some others, and they're connected to each other and changing in an organized way. And so maybe just like a hurricane is a process of water being spun around and held together, so you are a hurricane, but of emotions and sensations and memories and experiences and thoughts. And maybe hurricane is kind of a violent metaphor, but a calmer process, maybe more like a calm flowing river. I suggested that we might be fuzzy processes, right? The edge of a river is fuzzy, the edge of a hurricane or other weather system is fuzzy. What might be a fuzzy edge that we have? Well, suppose you go to Coachella or some other concert, and you have a good experience. Well, part of what's going on is that your emotions and feelings are interacting with all the other people's emotions and feelings, right? It's they're feeling things, and those feelings very quickly have effects on you. You feel things, and they very quickly have effects on other people. That your emotions are largely in that situation being interacting with other people's emotions pretty directly, so that there's a fuzziness at the edge of the container of your emotions and their emotions. Or a calmer example, something that's very important in early childhood, is what's called joint attention, and it's how children learn a lot about language. Is in joint attention, the caregiver and the child have their attention is focused on the same thing, and then their attention moves around to different objects, and they both are attending to the same different things at different times, and there's some sort of awareness in both of their minds that they are attending to the same thing and that they're being held together. And so the process that's happening in one mind and the process that's happening in another mind, well, there's one process that's sort of overlapping that's holding them together, this process of maintaining their attention on the same object. And so in that way, the barrier between the mind of the child and the mind of the parent or the caregiver is broken down a little bit, and they're actually interacting and being held together. And in that way, we might think that the barriers are fuzzy. So by saying you're a psychological process, you have many parts, many psychological parts, sensations, memories, thoughts, and all that. They interact in complex ways. They're constantly changing. There aren't sharp edges between, or at least there's not always sharp edges between the process that's you and another process. There's nothing that holds all those parts together. What we have is just a connection of organized changing parts, just the stream of experience and the psychological processes interacting among them, and no further entity or being that holds them all together. Well, so what matters then if we're fuzzy processes, right? Because if we're fuzzy processes, then there's not that one sort of thing that we can focus on to say, okay, it's the survival of that's so important. It's the survival of the steel ball that's me, that's what's important. What might be important instead? Well, there's no you beyond the stream of experience. There are few sharp lines about who each of us is. So what does matter? Continuity of the most important psychology, perhaps, and of our values. So, and maybe our death actually is not so bad because many of lots of our psychology, what is most important about our psychology and our values, can continue even though we have died. So when talking about this, Parfit says the following. He says, is the truth depressing? This truth that there's what he thinks is the truth, that there's just a stream of experiences and no further entity. He says, some may find it so, but I find it liberating and consoling. When I believed that my existence was such a further fact, that I was this further being holding together my stream of experiences, I seemed imprisoned in myself. My life seemed like a glass tunnel through which I was moving faster every year, and at the end of which there was darkness. When I changed my view, the walls of my glass tunnel disappeared. I now live in the open air. There is still a difference between my life and the lives of other people. We're not fuzzy in every way. But the difference is less. Other people are closer. I'm less concerned about the rest of my own life and more concerned about the lives of others. So how might we pursue these values if what matters is not survival itself? How can I continue without my survival? Well, altruistic action, right? I can have really positive impacts on others that are going to be realizing my values, and that might be sort of spreading my psychology around, and that way I continue through my effects on others, and in particular through deep relations that I might have with other people. And sort of what attitude should we have towards our own life in this view? Well, so there's this something, it's sort of a prayer, it's kind of a poem that a character from Kurt Vonnegut's Cradle novel says sort of towards the end of the novel. So it talks about God, but it's not actually, God is not in a way important, as I'll explain. So it goes like this. God made mud. God got lonesome. So God said to some of the mud, "Sit up. See all I've made," said God, "the hills, the sea, the sky, the stars." And I was some of the mud that got to sit up and look around. Lucky me, lucky mud. I, mud, sat up and saw what a nice job God had done. Nice going, God. Nobody but you could have done it, God. I certainly couldn't have. I feel very unimportant compared to you. The only way I can feel the least bit important is to think of all the mud that didn't even get to sit up and look around. I got so much, and most mud got so little. Thank you for the honor. Now mud lies down again and goes to sleep. What interesting other kinds of sitting up mud I met. I loved everything I saw. Good night. So here, that's not, I left some stuff out of that, but we don't need to worry about that. The mud is expressing this gratitude that, like, wow, like, I'm alive and I'm conscious, and that's really cool. And yeah, I'm not going to exist forever, but there's all this good stuff that I do get to experience while I exist. And then, and we can combine that with this sort of Parfit observation, or this Buddhist observation or whatever, that in many ways, those things that are valuable can continue even once you cease to exist. So this is a different way of looking at personal identity and saying maybe we shouldn't be so focused on the identity of the person, and maybe we should be more focused on what matters about survival, and that a lot of that we can sort of pay attention to that right now and be glad that we have it, and that a lot of it can continue even after we cease to exist, because and that in a way is really good even though we have ceased to exist. So I have certainly not definitively established either sort of this view of what we are, or that all those other views of personal identity are wrong, or that what matters is distinct from what happens in survival. But I think they're interesting, provocative ideas, and might be worth thinking about.